A few weeks ago, I was reading the extremely excellent reporting that New York Magazine did on the way that the Israel-Hamas war is taking shape in New York City. And the article begins with a quote from Seth Pinsky, the CEO of the 92nd Street Y. He says, "I just want to start by saying this has been excruciating." And I think that about sums it up. He goes on to talk about that the reason this has been so excruciating is because in other times of crisis, he says, we were all in it together. We were all focused on rebuilding. The ... of that sentence, of course, is that in this crisis, it does not feel like we are all in it together. This moment in Jewish American history is particularly fraught because we have set ourselves up against one another, or at least it feels that way. And there's something uniquely draining and damaging about seeing yourself against your own community, your own family, to use a maybe overused term. And because it is so draining, we wind up calcifying against one another instead of seeking each other out. The result is that regardless of what is happening on the ground in Israel and Gaza, here in the States, we are now extremely, perhaps irrevocably divided. Right now in Brooklyn, they have this series of minyanim that meets, sort of each minyan takes a turn and meets each Friday night. And they're all basically about the same with a little bit of difference. And right now, there is one minyan that has set itself up as the pro-Israel minyan, and there's one Israel that set itself up as the anti-Zionist minyan. And they're basically the same minyan. I mean, they're basically saying the same prayers, but that's the difference. Probably their prayer for Israel looks different, I would imagine. And I wish I was joking about that, but that's what's happening right now. So let me be clear. I think in actuality, most rational people, not everyone, of course, but most rational people are not that far away from each other on this subject. Most people I know want an end to the killing and an end to the bombing of thousands of Gazan civilians. And most people want the surety that every hostage will be returned safely back to their family and that every Israeli can live without the fear of another October 7th. There's the question of which one to say first. And that feels so small. Do I say hostage return first and then ceasefire, or the other way around? It feels small, but it has become this huge and wide gulf that we've positioned ourselves on either side of with no way of crossing over. And also let me be clear that I know that there are extremes on both sides within the Jewish community, and those feel even further apart. When I see images of soldiers who are writing their names on rockets that will be sent into Gaza, my heart breaks. When I see real estate developers and Jews who say, soon we will own beachfront property in Gaza, that's not just upsetting, but I feel ashamed. When I hear Netanyahu's explicit focus on the war above peace talks, and I hear about people in Gaza being forced to relocate, I don't even have words to describe how not okay I feel that is. And I also know that spaces where Jews are furthering a narrative where there is no space for Jewish grief or Jewish sadness, that's equally heartbreaking for me. When other Jews are unable to see Israel as anything other than an evil global superpower and are not able to acknowledge how beautiful the people of Israel are and how complex and joyful Israeli culture is, equally heartbreaking. Even more so right now, we feel so apart from one another. This week in the Torah, we come to the conclusion of the Joseph narrative, another story where brothers have turned against one another. Last week, we saw that they were finally able to reconcile and embrace each other. But Vayechi this week reveals that that reconciliation was tenuous. After Jacob dies, the brothers look at one another and say, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and wants revenge? In fact, they're so nervous about this that they falsely tell Joseph that Jacob had one dying wish, which is that Joseph should forgive his brothers fully. This is after all the drama and the emotion of last week. There were tears, there was embracing, there was revealing of long-held secrets and a family reunion. At this point in the story, they've been together through the sadness of Jacob's death. They've even buried him together. And yet, still, even after all that, the brothers are still unsure whether Joseph will really be able to look at them the same way ever again. And I think in some sense, that's what we as a Jewish community are worried about too. At some point, please God, the war will be over. But after all is said and done, will we who have stationed ourselves against each other be able to come back together and look at one another again? Or is this the beginning of a schism that cannot be repaired? I thought it was only fitting to look at this moment in the text and see if there is anything hopeful or helpful to be gained from using these long ago brothers, these titular B'nai Israel, as our model. The text says the brothers looked at one another and said, "What if Joseph still holds a grudge?" The commentaries ask, why do they think this? And the answer is that it's because since Jacob's death, Joseph has been acting differently. And he's been treating them differently. It used to be that they would spend time together and dine together. But since his father's death, Joseph has stopped inviting his brothers for meals, the commentaries say. He has turned very inward and shut his brothers out. It's worth remembering here that Joseph has spent much of his life away from his father, not knowing whether he was really alive or dead, and his actual death may have a different impact on Joseph than his brothers. I think there's something extremely beautiful about this interpretation, which is that grief changes us. We do not necessarily act like our best selves in times of deep grieving. We do not necessarily reach out even when it is clear that we are feeling alone. We do not always do what is best for us. In this moment of intense sadness, Joseph pushes his brothers away, and the brothers feel it. And for us too, no matter what side we're on in this conflict, I'm using side like this, but the grief of the situation is changing us. It is making it so we are shutting each other out. Even on the most extreme sides, I feel this is true. We are not our best selves when we are in grief. How does this relate to reconciliation, to eventually being able to come back together? I'm not sure it's as simple as just acknowledging each other's grief. Now that this has been going on for months, it feels we're past that point. Maybe it means we have to start all our sentences with a preemptive apology. I'm sorry I was not my best self when you needed me to be. I'm sorry for the words I said when I couldn't see straight and couldn't think straight. I'm sorry for how I only focused on my own reactions and emotions and couldn't even begin to offer the space you needed for you to do that too. Maybe we will have to begin by acknowledging how intensely this grief has changed us and start all our sentences with remorse on all sides. The commentaries say one other thing about this scene, about the part where the brothers approach Joseph with a lie. The rabbis ask, why lie? Why would the brothers go through with all of this, fabricate a situation that is so clearly false? Of course, Jacob could have told Joseph to forgive his brothers when he was alive. He didn't need to rely on a posthumous message by way of the brothers. So why go through with such a bold-faced lie? And the rabbis read this favorably. They say the brothers did all of this for the sake of peace with Joseph. So important to them was living the rest of their days peacefully together that they went through with this whole charade. How does this inform our own reconciliation? Maybe it's meant to indicate that unless there is an active desire to reconcile, to create peace, to come back together, it won't happen. We have to convince ourselves, or at least pretend, that we must come back together. We must learn to forgive one another, or at least put our differences aside, even if it's a little false. Even if we will always hold our own opinions at odds with each other in our hearts. Even if that's true, that's still not a good enough reason to write one another off completely. That's how great God's desire for peace between brothers is. Even if we will never be fully aligned, it is that important. Is this naive? Is it a pipe dream? Possibly. I don't know. I just finished reading the poet Maggie Smith's memoir called You Could Make This Place Beautiful. It's about her divorce. And toward the end of her book, she asks, can there be peace without forgiveness? I'm not sure, but it seems important that we try. Otherwise, this will just continue to be excruciating. If you don't believe me, let me offer one last argument from the rabbis. They say the brothers' lie was all for the sake of peace, and then they offer a psalm, as if in proof that connection and kinship between brothers is God's greatest desire. And it is none other than Psalm 122, which we just heard the chorus sing so beautifully last week, which says, "Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May those who love you be at peace. May there be well-being within your ramparts, peace in your citadels. For the sake of my kin and my friends, I pray for your well-being. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I seek your good. L'man achai v're'ai, adabra na shalom bach. For the sake of my kin, my brothers, I pray for your well-being. L'ma'an beit Adonai Eloheinu, avaksha tov lach. For the sake of the house of God, I seek your good." Shabbat shalom. And I'd like to ask Larry to sing those ending lines, L'ma'an achai v're'ai, on page 120 in your Siddur if you want to follow along.